Is grief an individual sport? A few years ago, I interviewed this man, Dan, for the podcast. He wanted to talk about his friend, Darren, his best friend, who he had lost, I think, 6 months before. And when I say lost, I do mean that his friend died. He was not mysteriously misplaced. But in the aftermath of this grief, Dan felt the way a lot of people felt. He felt completely lost. And in our conversation, Dan described grief as feeling like an individual sport. And when he said that, I wanted to push back to say, no, of course not. You're not alone in your grief. And I thought about ring theory, which, if you haven't heard about it, it is the idea that every tragedy, in this case, the death of a friend, has a center to it. And around that center, you draw rings to represent proximity to that loss. So closest to that bullseye, it would be your immediate family, your wife, your kids, then other family members, and then, your best friend, and then friends of a second or third tier, and then acquaintances. You get it. It just keeps going because loss resonates. It has this ripple effect. I wanted to say, you can't be alone. Look at all these other circles. There's so many other people who are also grieving Darren. But who was I to say that, really? Because you actually might be alone in your grief, or at the very least, it can feel that way. Even if you have a million friends left, even if you have an incredibly supportive family, even if you know that you are one of just hundreds of people who miss this same person. Because when somebody dies and we are grieving them, we are grieving the version of them that we knew. Every person is the center of their own hub. And the person that we are missing, even if it is technically the same person, it's not the exact same person. It's how my 3 siblings and I all lost our dad, but we all lost different versions of our dad. I was 31 years old when my dad died. My dad died right before my husband died. Couldn't let him have the attention. Honestly, had to beat him there. When my husband Aaron died of brain cancer, I was, as far as I know, his only wife. He was his mom's only son. He was his sister's only brother. We all lost different versions of him. I wanted to say, you can't be alone. Of course you're not alone. Look at all those other rings, but who was I to say that? Because you actually might be alone in your grief, or at the very least, you might feel that way, and that feeling is real. The writer C.S. Lewis, who you probably know from The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, he wrote this book called A Grief Observed. This is a very old copy. I mean, so old. His wife died in 1960, and this book came out in 1961, which is really not that long. I mean, that's 1 year. You can do the math. But he published this book. It's called A Grief Observed, and he originally published it under a pseudonym because he didn't want to be associated with grief, and he didn't want to be associated with the thoughts and feelings that he was having, the thoughts and feelings that he put to paper and eventually published in this book. He was, at the time, an enormously successful writer. He was a literary celebrity. He was beloved, he was praised, and he still felt so alone. I'm going to read you something from this book. Look at all the pages I tabbed. An odd byproduct of my loss is that I'm aware of being an embarrassment to everyone I meet. At work, at the club, in the street, I see people, as they approach me, trying to make up their minds about whether they'll say something about it or not. I hate it if they do, and if they don't. Only after C.S. Lewis died in 1963 was this book published under his own name. So the people who read this book had no idea that they were reading the feelings of a man whose books that they had probably read and loved, a man that they deeply admired. He felt so alone. He felt so isolated, like there was nobody who understood what he was going through. And I read this book 60 some years after it was published, and I fully understood what he meant. How some people will see you in the grocery store and pretend like they didn't, walk the other way, or ask how you are and hope you just say fine because they are not in any way prepared to hear the truth. The team sport aspect of grief has its limits. Even if you have a culture or a faith system with very clear communal grief rituals, if you sit Shiva, if you hold awake, if you invite your entire community to a repast, you still go home with your own personal pan pizza of grief with your own topping selection. We can let that metaphor go right now and just get back to C.S. Lewis. He wrote, "You can't really share someone else's weakness or fear or pain. It might conceivably be as bad as what the other person felt, but it would still be quite different, and it can't be transferred." And I understood that because what I've learned from my own grief and from talking to literally thousands of people about theirs is that grief is as personal as it is universal. When we grieve, we are grieving our relationship to that person and the version of that person who belonged only to us. I have 3 siblings, and each of us lost a different version of our father, because even if your parents say that they love you all equally, and they do, they love you differently, or they should, because we are all different people. I have a friend whose husband died right before mine did. He died tragically, and after this very tragic, very sudden death, she got an angry message from a person who had been friends with both her and her dead husband. And it was a message where this mutual friend of theirs was saying that he was upset with her because she had not done enough to help him through his grief. He needed her, and she wasn't there. Her first reaction was guilt. It was, oh no, I have failed a friend. I have not been there for him. He misses my husband. I can't believe that I failed him. And her second feeling, one that I understood a lot more, was anger, because she had not even had a moment to put on her own oxygen mask and get the air flowing. She had a kid to do the same thing for. And it's funny to me that the things that we understand as crucial when a plane is crashing, we somehow forget when someone's life is crashing. The loss of his friend was real. It was valid. It was painful, of course, but he couldn't or just didn't see that she was also mourning her partner, her life partner, the person she wanted to spend the rest of her life with, her child's father, that she had a responsibility to save herself, to get her kid through this, that she did not have the emotional or mental capacity to be a grief guide for a fully grown adult man. It doesn't mean that his grief wasn't real. It was, but it means that his grief was his. I was 31 years old when my husband Aaron died of brain cancer, and I was, as far as I know, his only wife, aside, of course, from Gwen Stefani, who he wanted listed in the obituary as his first wife. She's never commented on that, by the way. He was his mother's only son. He was his sister's only brother. He was a friend to so many people, but he was a different friend to all of them. And there was something about that realization that softened me eventually, that helped me stop treating my grief like Gollum with the ring, like, my precious, my grief, I'm so sad. Because that does happen. It happens. You wrap yourself around this loss and it becomes the center of your world, and then you are a bald, bony man eating raw fish underneath a mountain. But the point of this is that your grief is yours. It is yours to bear. It is your responsibility. In the words of the poet and prophet Natasha Bedingfield, no one else can feel it for you, only you can let it in. Maybe she wrote that song about grief. You can only go to therapy for yourself, even though every time I go, I'm like, could this by osmosis help the other people that I am discussing in therapy? We do need each other, and healing in community with other people is a gift that should be available to everybody and isn't, thanks to capitalism. A rant for another time. I'm not saying we don't need other people. We do need other people, but we just can't expect other people to process the grief for us, to be our unpaid and unlicensed therapist, to drop everything to clean up our scrapes when they have lost a limb. So re-enter ring theory. This was coined by the psychologist Susan Silk and her friend Barry Goldman, and it really is this simple. Comfort in, dump out. The person at the center of the loss, in this case my friend and her son, are at the center. That friend was on an outer ring. He could have barfed out all of that pain about how he felt lost and alone and didn't feel supported in his grief to someone in an outer ring. You can still have all of your feelings. You have to have them in the appropriate direction. You pour comfort toward the center. You get your other feelings out further, preferably with a therapist. But if we want to take this theory and iterate on it, which I have and I will, I think that when someone we love dies, we are all at the center of our own ring in a way. Like I said, Erin's mom was the center of her own ring. That was her son. Erin's sister was at the center of her own ring. That was her brother. And that is why grief feels like an individual sport, because we are all tending to our own wounds, and it can take a lot of time and work to feel like we are well enough to see people in their own circles. But if grief is an individual sport, and once I get a metaphor going, guys, I'm gonna keep going with it. It doesn't even have to really make sense, but I did have to Google, what's an individual sport? What would be an individual sport? Guess what? Golf is. I should have known that because I was on the golf team in high school. I founded it. I was one of the worst golfers in the state of Minnesota from the years 1998 to 2001. The Minnesota State High School League does keep track, and I was right there at the below the bottom. Should not have played. Apologies to everybody who played with me because I had a bad attitude, and it does take a long time to golf with somebody who gets a 23 on a par 5. That's embarrassing. I shouldn't tell people that. But the point is, it's an individual sport. And when you're out there swinging your club 23 times on a par 5, something that absolutely did happen, possibly more than once, and you're feeling bad about yourself and you go to the clubhouse, then they also tally up all of your teammates' scores too, and they might pull you up from the bottom, not individually, but as a team. And that is eventually what Dan does. Dan goes to therapy. Dan starts showing up for Darren's family, for his wife, for his kids. Their losses aren't the same, of course not, but they don't need to be. And he found a lot of comfort in that. He found comfort in that proximity. He said that every time he did something for Darren's family, he felt like he was giving his buddy a high five. It made him feel closer to the friend he lost, to be there for the other people who still loved them, to be there for the other people who still loved and missed his friend. If grief feels lonely for you, I am begging for you to tell someone in your life the truth, because they really don't know. When you are at the center of that loss, when you are the middle ring, that little dot that all of the rings surround, people look to you for guidance. They think that you are the expert in this loss because, I'm sorry, you are. You're the expert and you're new at it. You're hardly an expert at anything, and you have to learn a language and teach it to other people at the same time. It's not a good system, but it's the one we've got. You are the boss of your grief, and someone in your life will show up if you can tell them the truth, which is not that you are fine. And you don't need to know what you need from them to just say, I don't know what I need, but I'm not doing well. Don't sit there and wait for somebody to magically read your mind. People are notoriously bad at that. And if grief feels lonely for you, try to find one person who gets it. This might not be the people who are already in your life. It might not be your sister or your best friend or all the people who are still grieving this person. It might be a stranger. There's a writer that I admire. Her name is Nora McInerny. She wrote, "We are the luckiest, the surprising magic of a sober life." And she wrote this sentence that is about sobriety, but I think applies to pretty much anything. She wrote, "One stranger who understands your experience exactly will do for you what hundreds of close friends and family who don't understand cannot. It is the necessary palliative for pushing into change. It is the cool glass of water in hell." If you lost a partner, you need to meet another widow. And I say widow with reckless abandon. I don't think you need to be married for it to count. I don't think you even need to be. I also use widow as a gender neutral. I just don't think we need a different word for like a man. Like, just be a widow. Why do you widower? What's the point? You need to find your people. You need to find your cool glass of water in hell. If you want to hear Dan and Darren's full friendship story, there is a link to it in our description, along with some links to books that helped me with my own grief, including This Bad Boy by C.S. Lewis. We also have a Patreon with over 275 episodes of our podcast, all organized by theme and topic, and facets of grief that are beyond death. Because if grief got a rebrand, I would give it the tagline, more than just death. Think about it. Very interested to know if you have felt like grief is an individual sport and what made you feel more connected. I'm Nora McInerny, and sometimes things are just terrible. Thanks for asking.